Without objection.
Today, the Senate will discuss questions of war and peace. Today, the Senate will do its constitutional duty for a change. Let us be very clear, though, that the Senate does this under duress. The Senate has abdicated its role in foreign policy for too long. We have been at war nearly continuously for 15 years, and the initiation, the conclusion, and the resumption of war has not had debate in this body. The last time we voted on whether or not we should be at war was the Iraq War, which is a very emotional vote, and a war that's long been over. There's now a new war in Iraq and Syria, but there's been no congressional authorization. Therefore, it's illegal and unconstitutional. Today's debate will attempt to debate whether or not we should initiate war in Yemen. Now, it's an indirect vote because they won't allow a direct vote. In fact, they would not allow this debate had I and several others not forced it. But this is a bipartisan coalition that has brought this issue to the floor and said, we should debate issues of war. I know young men who have lost limbs in the war. I know young men and their families who have sacrificed their lives. They deserve to have the country debate when and where we should be at war. It should never be something that we slide into. Now, some will say, no, you're debating over whether to sell arms to Yemen. Yes, but I would also argue that we are at war in Yemen, and whether or not we sell arms to Saudi Arabia, I meant to say, for the war in Yemen, is something that should be debated because it's not just about selling arms. It's about whether or not we will be complicit in a war in Yemen. If there is no debate in Congress, if there is no debate in the public, are we ready to spend lives and money and treasure on another war in Yemen? People will say, oh, no big deal, we're not really at war in Yemen. Well, yes, we are. We are refueling Saudi bombers that are dropping bombs in Yemen. There are said to be over 3,000 innocent people who have died in Yemen from Saudi bombs. What do you think happens to those families when 100 people die at a wedding in Yemen? What do you think happens to those families? Do you think they have a warm, fuzzy feeling for Saudi Arabia and the United States that's helping to pick the targets and fuel the planes? Don't you think we as a country ought to have a debate before we go to war? Don't you think we ought to read the Constitution? Our founding fathers had a significant, detailed, and explicit debate over war. They explicitly took the power to declare war, and they gave it to the legislature. Madison wrote that the executive is the branch most prone to war. Therefore, with studied care, the Constitution took the power to declare war and vested it in the legislature. This is repeated throughout the Federalist Papers. It is repeated by all of our founding fathers that the power to initiate war was too important to place in the hands of one individual. But over the last decade and a half, we've been at war in Libya without the permission of the American people or Congress. We've been at war in Syria and Iraq without the permission of the American people. And now we are at war in Yemen without the approval of Congress or the American people. So this is a twofold debate today. It's a debate over whether or not the United States should be at war without a vote of Congress. And I think our founding fathers were clear on this. It was absolutely certain that it was supposed to be a prerogative of Congress. But there's also practical concerns. Some have come to the floor and said, well, Saudi Arabia is an imperfect ally. Well, I'd go a little bit farther. Saudi Arabia has often done things that have not been good for America and not been in our national interest and not been consistent with our understanding of human rights. Let's give a few examples. The girl of Qatif was raped by 7 men. Saudi Arabia put her in prison for the crime of being alone with a man. You see, it's a woman's fault because women don't get to testify. The testimony comes from her attackers, and the woman of Qatif was given 7 years in prison and 200 lashes. There is a poet who was writing in Indonesia, who was Saudi Arabian, who was picked up by Interpol and taken home to be given the death penalty for possible criticism of the state religion. There is a young 19-year-old man who is a Shia, a minority, who was a protester at a rally at, I think, 17. Actually, I think he's 21 now. He's been in prison for 4 years. His uncle was beheaded by the government a month or two ago and was, by all appearances, a religious leader, not a collaborator, not an espionage perpetrator. The young man is now 21, been in prison for 4 years. He faces beheading in Saudi Arabia. And you might say, well, human rights just aren't important. We need to do what's important for us in the region. Well, we've given Saudi Arabia $100 billion worth of weapons. $100 billion. Okay, we didn't give it to them, we sold it to them. But you know what? I think the taxpayer owns our weaponry. We have an ownership interest in our weaponry. This is not the free market. The weaponry was developed with taxpayer money and with explicit reservations that we, Congress, can control who it's sold to. So we do need to ask, and it's an important debate, and we should be having it here in this body instead of leaving it up to the president, having the debate, is Saudi Arabia a good ally? Well, we've had this war in Syria for some time now, and it's a messy war, and it's a sectarian war. Most of the rebel groups are Sunni Muslim, and the government is more allied, they're Alawite, but more allied with the Shiites. So in this war, there have been hundreds and hundreds of tons of weapons, some by us, but maybe tenfold more by Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And there have been public report after public report after public report saying that these weapons that we are pouring, or Saudi Arabia is pouring in to Saudi Arabia, have been given indiscriminately. They have been weapons that some would say, oh, they're being given to the pro-Americans. One group said when they were done with Assad, they would go after Israel. Doesn't sound like people that are necessarily our friends. But many of these weapons, according to public reports that Saudi Arabia has bought from us and channeled into Syria, have gone to al-Nusra, an off-branch of al-Qaeda. They used the justification to go to war in Syria, the 9/11 justification that said we would go after those who attacked us. I thought that was al-Qaeda. And now we're giving arms to Saudi Arabia that's giving arms to al-Qaeda, al-Nusra. And there have been some reports that the arms have gone directly to ISIS. I think it's been indiscriminate, inexcusable, and not in our national interest. How do we know what's in our national interest? You have to have a debate. Instead, Congress wants to be a lapdog for an imperial presidency, Republican or Democrat, rubber stamp, here you go. Not even a rubber stamp, no vote, no discussion, nothing. We are forcing this debate against the wishes of both parties, because both parties are complicit in this. This is not a Republican versus Democrat thing. This is a bipartisan consensus, foreign policy consensus, that says we should always give weapons without conditions, indiscriminately. $100 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia, more than any other president. President Obama has given more, and you say, why does he do this? Well, because we released about $100 billion worth of Iranian assets, and the Saudis bug him and say, well, Iran's getting all this money, we need to get some too. We need weapons as well, because you let Iran have money back to buy weapons. So it fuels an arms race over there. But the great irony of this, and is something that is so ironic that this body cannot overcome, is that unanimously, this body voted to let 9/11 victims sue Saudi Arabia. Now, why would we let them sue that unless the people who voted unanimously actually believe that there's a possibility Saudi Arabia had something to do with 9/11? So the body that voted unanimously that there's a possibility that Saudi Arabia had something to do with 9/11 is now going to vote overwhelmingly to send weapons to the country they think might have had something to do with 9/11. Saudi Arabia, ally or enemy? I sometimes call them frenemy. I'm not arguing that they never do anything that's good for us. They do on occasion. But they also do many things that aren't good for us. As we look through the list of things, and we look through the arms that have been channeled into this region, you know, we wonder, will we be better off? Will our national security be better off or worse off? So, for example, as the weapons that Saudi Arabia poured into Syria, they pushed back Assad, and there became a vacuum in the Syrian civil war. Guess who came to occupy that vacuum? Guess who grew stronger and stronger in the absence of Assad and in the chaos of the civil war? ISIS. In Yemen, you have several factions fighting, maybe not quite as complicated as Syria, but you have Salafist. These are people who believe in the primitive, intolerant form of Islam that Saudi Arabia practices. These people are allied with Saudi Arabia, and they're fighting against rebels they call the Houthi rebels. The Houthi rebels are allied with Iran, and in all likelihood supplied by Iran. So they fight each other, and it's somewhat of a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And you say, well, don't we hate Iran so much that we have to be involved everywhere to stop Iran? Well, I don't know. I mean, Saudi Arabia funds hatred around the world. Does Iran fund madrasas in our country? Real good question. I don't think I've ever heard anybody ask it. Is Iran, I'm not apologizing for Iran by any means, but Iran, to my knowledge, does not fund madrasas in our country. Saudi Arabia does. Saudi Arabia funds madrasas around the world that teach hatred of America, hatred of the West, hatred of Christianity. And by the way, if you're a Christian, don't bother trying to go to Saudi Arabia. You're not allowed in Mecca, you're not allowed in Medina, and God forbid you try to bring a Bible in their country. This is who you want to send more weapons to? What of the Yemen war? What happens as the weapons pour into Yemen? Is it possible that ISIS and Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula sit by laughing and rubbing their hands and watching the war between the Houthis and the Salafists and then step into the breach? It's what happened in Syria. Are we not to learn the lessons of the Middle East? Are we to completely stick our head in the sand and say, we must always give weapons, and if we don't give weapons, that's isolationism? That's literally what some people are saying. Oh, it's isolationism not to send $100 billion worth of weapons. To send $1 billion less would somehow be isolationism. Well, perhaps it would send a message. There have been people who have described Saudi Arabia as both arsonist and firefighter, throwing fuel, adding fuel to the flames, and at times being our friend and being helpful, maybe giving us some information or some intelligence. The Syrian civil war, nothing good has come from that civil war. Arms have been plowed into on both sides and nothing good. But one concrete thing has come from the Syrian civil war: millions of refugees, millions of displaced people. They have flooded Europe, and they're wanting to come to America also. What do you think happens in Yemen if we put more weapons in there? What do you think happens in Yemen if we put more arms into Yemen? More or less refugees? There will be millions of refugees coming. They will be flooding out of Yemen if they can get out of there as the war accelerates. Does Saudi Arabia help with the refugees? Does Qatar help? Do any of the Gulf states take any refugees? Zero. Saudi Arabia has taken 0 refugees. So while they fan the flames, while they send arms into Syria and arms into Yemen and bombs into Yemen, they take 0 refugees from Yemen or from Syria. Somehow it always seems to be America's responsibility to pay for everything and to absorb the brunt of the civil wars throughout the Middle East. I think there's another answer. I'm not saying that we can't be allied with Saudi Arabia, but I'm saying they need a significant message sent to them. I'm saying they need to change their behavior. And I'm saying that there needs to be evidence that Saudi Arabia has changed their behavior. This evidence needs to be that they quit funding madrasas that preach hate, that they come into the modern world and quit beheading people when they don't like what they say, that they quit beating and imprisoning the victims of rape. I think that we should think long and hard about war. I think war that should always be the last resort, not the first resort. I don't think it should be easy to go to war. I think our founding fathers understood that. They did not want to give one man or one woman the power to declare war, the power to initiate war. That power was specifically and explicitly given to Congress. There is something to be said about the corrupting influence of power. Lincoln said that if you want to test a man, give him power. That the true test of whether a man can resist the allure of power. I think this president has on many occasions failed that allure. Whether it's privacy or whether it's issues of war, President Obama once was a defender of privacy and once was a defender of the Constitution. But for some reason, the power of the office has caused him to forget the constitutional restraints that disallow even him from creating, causing, engaging in war without our permission. But there's blame to go around. We, in partisan reasons, want to blame the other party sometimes. But if you look at the blame and who's to blame, there's a great deal of blame to go around. The president for taking us to war without our permission, but even more so, Congress's abdication of our role, abdication of our responsibility. The last vote on going to war was for the Iraq War, 2002. We have not voted to go back to war. We have abdicated our responsibility. There's a young man in the military currently who is actually suing over an order he was given to go to war because he says it's not constitutional for me to go to war without the permission of Congress. The president once understood this. This is a proxy debate over whether or not Congress has a role, whether or not we're relevant in foreign policy, and whether we will stand up and do our duty. We should be debating on this floor with every member present whether or not the president will be authorized to fight a war in Syria and Iraq. We should also have that same debate in Yemen because we are involved in the war in Yemen, and everyone who loses their life there believes that it's not only Saudi Arabia that's bombing them, they believe that it's us. We are refueling the bombers in midair. We are helping to choose the targets, and we have people embedded within this war zone. So make no mistake, we are at war in Yemen, and we are at war illegally and unconstitutionally and without the permission of Congress. We should immediately stop everything we are doing and debate a use of authorization of force for the Middle East. Everybody says they're for it on both sides, and yet it never happens because it's messy. It's messy also because I think the American people might wake up to the facts. They might wake up to the facts that, you know what, ISIS grew in the midst of a Syrian civil war. They might wake up to the facts that our involvement in the Yemen war may well make Al-Qaeda stronger, may well make ISIS stronger. This is a twofold debate. It's a debate over whether or not you can go to war without the authority of Congress, but it's also a debate over selling arms and whether they will be in our national interest. See, I think we still do own those arms. Those arms are not privately owned by a company. We paid for the research for them. They are owned by the taxpayer, and they are, by law, restricted in where they can be sold. I don't believe that Saudi Arabia is an ally that we can trust. The fact that they continue to support schools in our country, to continue to support schools that, preach hatred of our country, preach hatred of Israel, preach hatred of civilization as far as I'm concerned, I just don't see how we send them the correct message by saying you can have unlimited arms from us. No, some say this is too far, I say this is too little. But I think there will be something that occurs today. It occurs despite what the majority wants, but this is a debate. But this isn't the end of the debate. If we lose the battle on the vote, we will have begun the debate over whether Congress is relevant, whether or not we go to war without the permission of Congress. This is the beginning of the debate, and part of the victory is that we are having this debate. But mark my words, we're only having this debate because it's been forced upon Congress. No one on either side of the aisle wants this debate. If they could, this would be shuffled under the rug. It's only occurred because the law mandates that they allow it to occur. But this should be occurring on moments of war, on issues of war, and I regret that we don't do it, and I hope in the future that this will be a lesson to the American people and to the Senate that it is our duty, and there is no duty above our duty to decide when and where we go to war. Thank you.
Madam President.